Chapter 3. Sane Perception. 1. The need to study. All learning involves attention and study at some level. This course is a mind training course. Good students assign study periods for themselves. However, since this obvious step may not have occurred to you, and since you are cooperating in this, I urge you to make the obvious assignment now. You may understand the need to study this course, yet still not realize that many of the problems you keep being faced with may already have been solved here. Perhaps you do not think of the course in this way at all. Or perhaps you do from time to time, but then think the answer is probably in here and do not look it up. You vaguely know that the course is intended for some sort of preparation, but are you prepared? Mental retardation is a defense which, like the others, with the exception of the atonement, can be used on behalf of error or truth, as elected. When it occurs in the literal sense, it is a temporary device, agreed on beforehand to check the miscreative activities of a strong but misdirected will. The lesson involves not only the individual himself, but also his parents, siblings, and all of those who come in close relations with him. The person himself is a poor learner by definition, but only as a step toward changing from a bad to a good one. Mental retardation can also be used, however, as a maladaptive defense if the wrong or attack side is employed. This produces the pseudo-retardation syndrome, which is justly classified as a psychiatric or disturbed level symptom. You may well be using this defense as you read this course. This represents a joint attack on both yourself and me, because it renders your mind weak and mine incompetent. Remember, this puts you in a truly fearful position. If you cannot understand either your own mind or mine, you do not know what is really willed. It is thus impossible to avoid behavior will conflict, as defined before, because even if you acted according to will, you wouldn't know it. The next part of this course rests too heavily on the earlier part not to require its study. Without this, you will become much too fearful when the unexpected does occur to make constructive use of it. However, as you study the earlier part, you will see some of the obvious implications unless you still persist in misusing the defense of mental retardation. Please remember that its constructive use, described above, is hardly a real part of your own real equipment. It is particularly inappropriate defense as you use it, and I can only urge you to avoid it. The reason why a solid foundation is necessary at this point is because of the highly likely confusion of fearful and awesome, which most people do make. You will remember that we said once before that awe is inappropriate in connection with the sons of God, because you should not experience awe in the presence of your own equals. But it was emphasized that awe is a proper reaction of the Son in the presence of his Creator. So far, this course has had only indirect recourse to God and rarely even refers to him directly. I have emphasized that awe is not appropriate in connection with me because of our inherent equality. I have been careful to clarify my own role in the atonement, without either over or understating it. I have tried to do exactly the same thing in connection with yours. The next step, however, does involve the direct approach to God himself. It would be most unwise to start on this step at all without very careful preparation, or all will surely be confused with fear, and the experience will be more traumatic than beatific. Healing is of God in the end. The means are carefully explained in this course. Revelation may occasionally show you the end, but to reach it, the means are needed. 2. Special principles for miracle workers. The miracle abolishes the need for lower order concerns. Since it is an illogical or out of pattern time interval by definition, the ordinary considerations of time and space do not apply. I do not regard time as you do, and your space problems are not mine. When you perform a miracle, I will arrange both time and space to adjust to it. A clear distinction between what was created and what is made is essential. All forms of correction or healing rest on this fundamental correction in level perception. Another way of stating the second principle is this: never confuse right-mindedness with wrong-mindedness. Responding to any form of miscreation with anything except a desire to heal or a miracle is an expression of this confusion. The miracle is always a denial of this error and an affirmation of the truth. Only right-mindedness can create in a way that has any real effect. Pragmatically, what has no real effect has no real existence. Its real effect, then, is emptiness. Being without substantial content, it lends itself to projection. The level adjustment power of the miracle induces the right perception for healing. Until this has occurred, healing cannot be understood. Forgiveness is an empty gesture unless it entails correction. Without this, it is essentially judgmental rather than healing. Miraculous forgiveness involves only correction. It has no element of judgment at all. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, in no way evaluates what they do. It is strictly limited to an appeal to God to heal their minds. There is no reference to the outcome of their misthought. This does not matter. The biblical injunction, be of one mind, is the statement for revelation readiness. My own injunction, do this in remembrance of me, is the request for cooperation in miracle working. It should be noted that the two statements are not in the same order of reality, because the latter involves a time awareness, since memory implies recalling the past in the present. Time is under my direction, but timelessness belongs to God alone. In time, we exist for and with each other. In timelessness, we coexist with God. 3. Atonement without sacrifice. There is one more point which must be perfectly clear before any residual fear which you may still associate with miracles becomes entirely groundless. The crucifixion did not establish the atonement. The resurrection did. There is a point which many very sincere Christians have misunderstood. Nobody who was free of the scarcity fallacy could possibly have made this mistake. If the crucifixion is seen from an upside-down point of view, it certainly does appear as if God permitted and even encouraged one of his sons to suffer because he was good. Many very devoted ministers preach this every day. This particularly unfortunate interpretation, which actually arose out of the combined projection of a large number of my own would-be followers, has led many people to be bitterly afraid of God. This particular anti-religious concept happens to enter into many religions, and this is neither by chance nor coincidence. The real Christian would have to pause and ask, how could this be? Is it likely that God himself would be capable of the kind of thinking which his own words have clearly stated is unworthy of his children? The best defense, as always, is not to attack another's position, but rather to protect the truth. It is not necessary to consider anything acceptable if you have to turn a whole frame of reference around in order to justify it. This procedure is painful in its minor applications and genuinely tragic on a mass basis. Persecution is a frequent result, justified by the terrible misperception that God himself persecuted his own Son on behalf of salvation. The very words are meaningless. It has always been particularly difficult to overcome this, because although the error itself is no harder to overcome than any other error, people are unwilling to give it up because of its prominent escape value. In milder forms, a parent says, "This hurts me more than it hurts you," and feels exonerated in beating a child. Can you believe that the father really thinks this way? It is so essential that all such thinking be dispelled that we must be very sure that nothing of this kind remains in your mind. I was not punished because you were bad. The holy benign lesson which the atonement teaches is wholly lost if it is tainted with this kind of distortion in any form. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, is strictly a karmic viewpoint. It is a real misperception of truth, by which you assign your own evil past to God. The evil conscience from the past has nothing to do with God. He did not create it, and he does not maintain it. God does not believe in karmic retribution at all. His divine mind does not create that way. He does not hold the evil deeds of a person even against himself. Is it likely that he would hold them against me? Be very sure that you recognize how impossible this assumption really is, and how entirely it arises from projection. This kind of error is responsible for a host of related fallacies, including the mistaken belief that God rejected man and forced him out of the Garden of Eden, or that I am misdirecting you. I have made every effort to use words which are almost impossible to distort, but human beings are very inventive when it comes to twisting symbols around. God himself is not symbolic. He is fact. The atonement, too, is totally without symbolism. It is perfectly clear because it exists in light. Only the world's attempts to shroud it in darkness have made it inaccessible to the unwilling and ambiguous to the partly willing. The atonement itself radiates nothing but truth. It therefore epitomizes harmlessness and sheds only blessing. It could not do this if it arose from anything other than perfect innocence. Innocence is wisdom because it is unaware of evil, which does not exist. It is, however, perfectly aware of everything that is true. The resurrection demonstrated that nothing can destroy truth. Good can withstand any form of evil because light abolishes all forms of darkness. The atonement is thus the perfect lesson. It is the final demonstration that all of the other lessons which I taught are true. You are released from all errors if you believe this. The deductive approach to teaching accepts the generalization which is applicable to all single instances, rather than building up the generalization after analyzing numerous single instances separately. If you can accept the one generalization now, there will be no need to learn from many smaller lessons. Nothing can prevail against a Son of God who commends his spirit into the hands of his Father. By doing this, the mind awakens from its sleep and remembers its Creator. All sense of separation disappears and level confusion vanishes. The Son of God is part of the Holy Trinity, but the Trinity itself is one. There is no confusion within its levels, because they are of one mind and one will. This single purpose creates perfect integration, and establishes the reign of the peace of God. But this vision can be perceived only by the truly innocent. Because their hearts are pure, they defend true perception instead of defending themselves against it. Understanding the lesson of the atonement, they are without the will to attack, and therefore they see truly. This is what the Bible means when it says, "And when he shall appear or be perceived, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." Sacrifice is a notion totally unknown to God because it arises solely from fear of the records. This is particularly unfortunate because frightened people are apt to be vicious. Good teachers never terrorize their students. To terrorize is to attack, and this results in rejection of what the teacher offers. The result is learning failure. Sacrificing others in any way is a clear-cut violation of God's own injunction that you should be merciful, even as your Father in heaven is merciful. It has been harder for many Christians to realize that this commandment or assignment also applies to themselves. In other words, though Christians generally, but by no means universally, recognize the contradiction involved in victimizing others, they are less adept at ensuring their own inability to victimize themselves. Although this appears to be a much more benign error from the viewpoint of society, it is nevertheless inherently dangerous because once a two-edged defense is used, its direction cannot be self-controlled. It is obvious that these individuals have not been able to transcend the misperception of the need for sacrifice, or they could not possibly be willing to sacrifice themselves. Anyone who is unable to leave the requests of others unanswered has not entirely transcended egocentricity. I never gave of myself in this inappropriate way, nor would I ever encourage you to do so. I have been correctly referred to in the Bible as the Lamb of God who taketh away the sins of the world. Yet those who represent the Lamb as blood-stained, an all too widespread conceptual error, do not understand the meaning of the symbol. Correctly understood, the symbol is a very simple parable or teaching device which merely depicts my innocence. The lion and the lamb lying down together refers to the fact that strength and innocence are not in conflict, but naturally live in peace. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, is another way of saying the same thing. Only the innocent can see God. There has been some controversy in human terms as to whether seeing is an attribute of the eyes or an expression of the integrative powers of the brain. Correctly understood, the issue revolves around the question of whether the body or the mind can see or understand. This is not really open to question at all. The body is not capable of understanding. Only the mind knows anything. A pure mind knows the truth, and this is its strength. It cannot attack the body because it knows exactly what the body is. This is what a sound mind in a sound body really means. A sound mind is not out for blood. It does not confuse destruction with innocence because it associates innocence with strength, not with weakness. Innocence is incapable of sacrificing anything because the innocent mind has everything and strives only to protect its wholeness. This is why it cannot project. It can only honour others because honour is the natural greeting of the truly loved to others who are like them. The Lamb taketh away the sins of the world only in the sense that the state of innocence or grace is one in which the meaning of the atonement is perfectly apparent. The innocence of God is the true state of the mind of his Son. In this state, your mind does see God, and because you see him as he is, you know that the atonement, not sacrifice, is the only appropriate gift to your own altar, where nothing except perfection truly belongs. The understanding of the innocence is truth. That is why their altars are truly radiant. 4. Innocent perception. We have repeatedly stated that the basic concepts referred to throughout this course are not matters of degree. Certain fundamental concepts cannot be meaningfully understood in terms of coexisting polarities. It is impossible to conceive of light and darkness, or everything and nothing, as joint possibilities. They are all true or all false. It is absolutely essential that you understand completely that behavior is erratic until a firm commitment to one or the other is made. Yet a firm commitment to darkness or nothingness is impossible. Nobody has ever lived who has not experienced some light and some of everything. This has made everybody genuinely unable to deny truth totally, even if he deceives himself in this connection most of the time. That is why those who live largely in darkness and emptiness never find any lasting solace. Innocence is also not a partial attribute. It is not a real defense until it is total. When it is partial, it is characterized by the same erratic nature that holds for other two-edged defenses. The partly innocent are apt to be quite stupid at times. It is not until their innocence is a genuine viewpoint which is universal in its application that it becomes wisdom. Innocent or true perception means that you never misperceive and always see truly. More simply, this means that you never see what does not exist in reality. Whenever you lack confidence in what someone else will do, you are attesting to your belief that he is not in his right mind. This is hardly a miracle-based frame of reference. It also has the disastrous effect of denying incorrect use of denial, the essentially creative power of the miracle. The miracle perceives everything as it is. If nothing but the truth exists, and this is really redundant in statement because what is not true cannot exist, right-minded seeing cannot see anything but perfection. We have said many times that only what God creates and what you create with the same will has any real existence. This, then, is all that the innocent can see. They do not suffer from the delusions of the separated ones. The way to correct all such delusions is to withdraw your faith from them and invest it only in what is true. To whatever extent you side with false perception in yourself or others, you are validating a basic misperception. You cannot validate the invalid. I would suggest that you voluntarily give up all attempts to do so because they can be only frantic. If you are willing to validate what is true in everything you perceive, you will make it true for you. Remember that we said that truth overcomes all error. This means that if you perceive truly, you are cancelling out misperceptions in yourself and others simultaneously. Because you see them as they were really created and can really create, you offer them your own validation of their truth. This is the real healing which the miracle actively engenders. The reason why this section is so short, despite its extreme importance, is because it is not symbolic. This means that it is not open to more than one interpretation. This means that it is unequivocal. It also explains the biblical quotation, "But this we know, that when he shall appear or be perceived, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And every man that hath this hope in him purifieth himself, even as he is pure." Every man does have the hope that he can see correctly, because the ability to do so is in him. Man's only hope is to see things as they are. 5. Perception versus knowledge. You're confused about the difference between perception and knowledge. You will note that we have said very little about knowledge as yet. One of the exceptions is in the correction formula for fear, which begins with know first. The reason is because you must get your perceptions straightened out before you can know anything. To know is to be certain. Uncertainty merely means that you don't know. Knowledge is power because it is certain, and certainty is strength. Perception is temporary. It is an attribute of the space-time belief and is therefore subject to fear or love. Misperception produces fear, and true perception induces love. Neither produces certainty, because all perception varies. That is why it is not knowledge. True perception is the basis for knowledge, but knowing is the affirmation of truth. All of your difficulties ultimately stem from the fact that you do not recognize or know yourself, your brother, or God. Recognize means know again. This means you knew before. Note that it does not mean saw before. You can see in many ways because perception involves different interpretations, and this means it is not whole. The miracle is a way of perceiving, not a way of knowing. It is the right answer to a question, but you do not ask questions at all when you know. Questioning delusions is the first step in undoing them. The miracle, or the right answer, corrects them. Since perceptions change, their dependence on time is obvious. They are subject to transitory states, and this implies variability by definition. How you perceive at any given time determines what you do, and action must occur in time. Knowledge is timeless, because certainly is not questionable. You know when you have ceased to ask questions. The questioning mind perceives itself in time and therefore looks for future answers. The unquestioning mind is closed merely because it believes that the future and the present will be the same. This establishes an unchanged state, or stasis. This is usually an attempt to counteract an underlying fear that the future will be worse than the present, and this fear inhibits a tendency to question at all. Visions are the natural perception of the spiritual eye, but they are still corrections. The spiritual eye is symbolic, and therefore not a device for knowing. It is, however, a means of right perception, which brings it into the proper domain of the miracle, but not of revelation. Properly speaking, a vision of God is a miracle rather than a revelation. The fact that perception is involved at all removes the experience from the realm of knowledge. That is why these visions do not last. Note that the term insight, though referring to lofty perception, is not an attribute of knowledge. This is why terms like lofty are meaningless in this context. Insight is not the way to knowledge, but it is a prerequisite for knowledge. Being of God, knowledge has nothing to do with your perceptions at all. That is why it can only be a gift of God to you. An ancient proverb instructs you to know thyself, or be certain. Certainty is always of God. When you love someone, you have perceived him as he is, and this makes it possible for you to know him. But it is not until you recognize him that you know him. Only then are you able to stop asking questions about him. While you ask questions about God, you are implying that you do not know him. Certainty does not require action. When you say you are acting on the basis of sure knowledge, you're really confusing perception and knowledge. Knowledge brings mental strength for creative thinking, but not for right doing. Perception, miracles, and doing are closely related. Knowledge is a result of revelation and induces only thought. Perception involves the body even in its most spiritualized form. Knowledge comes from the altar within and is timeless because it is certain. To perceive the truth is not the same as knowing it. This is why students may have so much trouble with integrating this course. The tentative perception of some is too uncertain for knowledge because knowledge is sure. The perception of others is so variable that they swing from sudden but real knowledge to complete cognitive disorganization. If you attack another's error, you will hurt yourself. You do not recognize him when you attack. Attack is always made on a stranger. You are making him a stranger by misperceiving him, so that you cannot know him. It is because you have made him into a stranger that you are afraid of him. What is he to you? He is your brother. What else do you need to know? But do know that. This is not a matter of perception, but of fact. Perceive him correctly, so that you can know him. The prayer for the miracle is, Jesus, help me see my brother as he really is, and thus release both him and me. Any time there is anything unloving that crosses your mind, you should immediately recognize that you do not want to hurt your brother. Right perception is necessary before God can communicate directly to his own altars, which he has established in his sons. There, he can communicate his certainty, and his knowledge will bring the peace without question. God is not a stranger to his own sons, and his sons are not strangers to each other. Knowledge preceded both perception and time, and will also ultimately replace or correct for them. This is the real meaning of the biblical account of God as Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. It also explains the quotation, "Before Abraham was, I am." Perception can and must be stabilized, but knowledge is stable. Fear God and keep his commandments is a real scribal error. It should read, know God and accept his certainty. This error is why the commandments are almost all negative, in contrast to my statement, thou shalt love. There are no strangers in God's creation. To create as he created, you can create only what you know and accept as yours. God knows his children with perfect certainty. He created them by knowing them. He recognizes them perfectly. When they do not recognize each other, they do not recognize him. Brothers can misperceive one another, but they rarely maintain that they do not know each other. This is possible only if they maintain that they are not really brothers. 6. The divided mind. Most of the abilities you now possess are only shadows of your real strengths. Your spirit knows, loves, and creates. These are its unequivocal functions. All of your present functions are equivocal or open to question or doubt. This arises because you can no longer be certain how you will use them. You're therefore incapable of knowledge because you are uncertain. You are also incapable of true loving because you can perceive lovelessly. And you cannot create surely because perception deceives and illusions are not sure. Perception did not exist until the separation had introduced degrees, aspects, and intervals. The spirit has no levels, and all conflict arises from the concept of levels. Wars arise when some regard others as if they were on a different level. All interpersonal conflicts arise from this fallacy. Only the levels of the Trinity are capable of unity. The levels produced by the separation are disastrous. They cannot but conflict. This is because one is essentially meaningless to another. Freud realized this perfectly, and that is why he conceived as forever irreconcilable the different levels of his psyche. They were conflict-prone by definition because they wanted different things and obeyed different principles. In our perception of the psyche, there is an unconscious level, which properly consists only of the miracle ability and should be under my direction, and a conscious level, which perceives or is aware of impulses from both the unconscious and the superconscious. These are the sources of the impulses the conscious level receives. Consciousness is thus the level of perception, but not of knowledge. Again, to perceive is not to know. In this connection, Casey is more accurate than Freud. Consciousness was the first split that you introduced into yourself. You became a perceiver rather than a creator in the true sense. Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. Jung was right indeed in insisting that the ego is not the self, and that the self should be regarded as an achievement. He did not recognize, a term we now understand, that the achievement was God's. In a sense, the ego was a self-made attempt to perceive yourself as you wished, rather than as you are. This is an example of the creator confusion we spoke of before. You can only know yourself as you are because that is all you can be sure of. Everything else is open to question. The ego is the questioning compartment in the post-separation psyche, which you made for yourself. It is capable of asking questions, but not of perceiving wholly valid answers, because these are of knowledge and cannot be perceived. The endless speculation about the meaning of mind has led to considerable confusion, because the mind is confused. Only one-mindedness is without confusion. A separated or divided mind must be confused. A divided mind is uncertain by definition. It has to be in conflict because it is out of accord with itself. Intrapersonal conflict arises from the same basis as interpersonal. One part of the psyche perceives another part as on a different level and does not understand it. This makes the parts strangers to each other without recognition. This is the essence of the fear-prone condition, in which attack is always possible. You have every reason to feel anxious as you perceive yourself. This is why you cannot escape from fear until you know that you did not and cannot create yourself. You can never make this misperception valid, and when you at least perceive clearly, you will be glad you can't. Your creation is beyond variance by your own errors, and this is why you must eventually choose to heal the separation. Right-mindedness is not to be confused with a knowing mind, because it is applicable only to right perception. You can be right-minded or wrong-minded, and this is subject to degrees, a fact which clearly demonstrates a lack of association with knowledge. The term right-mindedness is properly used as the correction for wrong-mindedness and applies to the state of mind which induces accurate perception. It is miraculous because it heals misperception, and healing is indeed a miracle in view of how you perceive yourself. Only the sick need healing. The spirit does not need healing, but the mind does. Freud gave a very graphic but upside-down account of how the divisions of the mind arose from the bottom up. Actually, this is impossible because the unconscious cannot generate the conscious. You cannot create something you can't know. The ego, therefore, did not arise out of the unconscious. A lower order perception cannot produce a higher order one because it doesn't understand it. But a higher order perception can produce a lower order one by understanding it in terms of misperception. Perception always involves some misuse of will because it involves the mind in areas of uncertainty. The mind is very active because it has willpower. When it willed the separation, it willed to perceive. Until it chose to do this, it willed only to know. Afterwards, it had to will ambiguously, and the only way out of ambiguity is clear perception. The ego is as frail as Freud perceived it. The later theorists have tried to introduce a less pessimistic view, but they have looked in the wrong direction for their hope. Any attempt to endow the ego with the attributes of the spirit is merely confused thinking. Freud was more clear-sighted about this because he knew a bad thing when he perceived it. But he failed to recognize that a bad thing cannot exist. It is therefore wholly unnecessary to try to get out of it. As I have said before, the thing to do with the desert is to leave. The mind returns itself to its proper function only when it wills to know. This places it in the spirit's service, where perception is meaningless. The superconscious is the level of the mind which wills to do this. Freud was particularly distorted on this point, because he was getting too far up for comfort according to his own perception. But he was right in maintaining that the parts of the psyche cannot be correctly perceived either as things or as entirely separate. He would have thought better if he had said entirely separated. The mind did divide itself when it willed to make its own levels and the ability to perceive them. But it could not entirely separate itself from the spirit, because it is from the spirit that it derives its whole power to create. Even in miscreating, will is affirming its choice, or it would merely cease to be. This is impossible because it is part of the spirit, which God created and which is therefore eternal. The ability to perceive made the body possible, because you must perceive something and with something. This is why perception involves an exchange or a translation, which knowledge does not need. The interpretive function of perception, actually a distorted form of creation, then permitted you to interpret the body as yourself, which, although depressing, was a way out of the conflict you induced. This has already been covered in some detail. The superconscious, which knows, could not be reconciled with this loss of power because it was incapable of darkness. This is why it became almost inaccessible to the mind and entirely inaccessible to the body. It was perceived as a threat because light does abolish darkness by establishing the clear fact that it isn't there. The truth will always destroy error in this sense. This is not an active process of destruction at all. We have already emphasized the fact that knowing does not do anything. It can be perceived as an attacker, but it cannot attack. What you perceive as its attack is your own recognition of the fact that it can always be remembered, because it has never been destroyed. This is not a literal remembering as much as a real remembering. The unconscious should never have been reduced to a container for the waste products of conflict. Even as you perceive your psyche, every level has a creative potential, because nothing you make can wholly lose this. God and the sons he created remain in surety, and therefore know that no miscreation exists. Truth cannot deal with error that you are unwilling to have blotted out. I was a man who remembered the spirit and its knowledge, and as a man I did not attempt to counteract error with knowledge so much as to correct error from the bottom up. Thus, whenever you refuse to misperceive, you are indeed behaving as I behaved. I demonstrated both the powerlessness of the body and the power of the mind. By uniting my will with that of my Creator, I brought his light back into mine, which naturally remembered the Spirit and its own real purpose. I cannot unite your will with God's for you, but I can erase all misperceptions from your mind if you will bring it under my guidance. I am in a position to correct perception from the bottom up. This refers to the earlier analogy of the miracle's power to turn time from the horizontal to the vertical axis. Only your misperceptions stand in your way. Without them, your own choice is certain. Sane perception induces sane choosing. The atonement was an act based on true perception. I cannot choose for you, but I can help you make your own right choice. Many are called, but few are chosen should read. All are called, but few choose to listen. Therefore, they do not choose right. The chosen ones are merely those who choose right sooner. That is the real meaning of the celestial speed up. Strong wills can do this now, and they will find rest for their souls. God knows you only in peace, and this is your reality. 7. Beyond perception. We said before that the abilities which you possess are only shadows of your true strengths. The Spirit's true functions are knowing, loving, and creating. The intrusion of the ability to perceive, which is inherently judgmental, was introduced only after the separation. No one has been sure of anything since then. You will also remember that I made it very clear that the resurrection was the return to knowledge, which was accomplished by the union of my will with the Father's. Since the separation, the words create and make are inevitably confused. When you make something, you make it first out of a sense of lack or need, and second, out of a something that already exists. Anything that is made for a specific purpose. It has no true generalizability. When you make something to fill a perceived lack, which is obviously why you would make anything, you are tacitly implying that you believe in the separation. Knowing does not lead to doing, as we have frequently observed already. Earlier, the miracle was associated with perception and not with knowing. However, we also noted that prayer is the medium of miracles and also the natural communication of the Creator and the created. At root, prayer is always an affirmation of knowledge, not of accurate perception. That is why, unless perception has entered into it, it calls on revelation. The confusion between your own creation and what you make is so profound that it has literally become impossible to know anything, because knowledge is always stable. It is quite evident that you are not. Nevertheless, you are perfectly stable as God created you. In this sense, when your behavior is unstable, you are obviously disagreeing with God's idea of the creation. This is a fundamental right of yours, although not one you would care to exercise if you were in your right mind. The problem that is bothering you most is the fundamental question which you continually ask of yourself, but which cannot properly be directed to yourself at all. You keep on asking yourself what you are. This implies that the answer is not only one which you know, but one which is up to you. The first part of this statement is perfectly true, but the second part is not. We have frequently commented on the absolute necessity of correcting all fallacious thinking which associates you in any way with your own creation. You cannot perceive yourself correctly. You have no image at all. The word image is always perception related and is not a product of knowing. Images are symbolic and stand for something else. The current emphasis on changing your image is a good description of the power of perception, but it implies that there is nothing to know. Prayer is the medium of miracles, not because God created perceptions, but because God created you. At the beginning of this course, we said that you are a miracle. Therefore, the miracle worker is a miracle not of his own creation. Unless perception rests on some knowing basis, it is so unstable that it doesn't mean anything. Knowing is not open to interpretation because its meaning is its own. It is possible to interpret meaning, but this is always open to error because it involves the perception of meaning. All of these wholly needless complexities are the result of your attempt to regard yourself as both separated and unseparated at the same time. It is impossible to undertake a confusion as fundamental as this without engaging in further confusion. Methodologically, your mind has been very creative, but as always occurs when method and content are separated, it has not been utilized for anything but an attempt to escape a fundamental and entirely inescapable impasse. This kind of thinking cannot result in a creative outcome, though it has resulted in considerable ingenuity. It is noteworthy, however, that this ingenuity has almost totally divorced you from knowledge. Knowledge does not require ingenuity at all. When we say, "The truth shall set you free," we mean that all this kind of thinking is a waste of time, but that you are free of the need of engaging in it. Note again that the functions of the spirit were not referred to as abilities. This point requires clarification because abilities are beliefs which are based on the scarcity fallacy, since an ability does not mean anything apart from comparisons to the ability as it appears in others. Nobody has none of an ability, and nobody has all of it. That is, of course, why the bell curve never rests on the line. This relativity of abilities demonstrates that abilities are not functions of the spirit. The spirit's functions are not relative. They are absolute. They are of God and in God, and therefore godlike. Prayer is a way of asking for something. When we said that prayer is the medium of miracles, we also said that the only meaningful prayer is for forgiveness, because those who have been forgiven have everything. Once forgiveness has been accepted, prayer in the usual sense becomes utterly without meaning. Essentially, a prayer for forgiveness is nothing more than a request that may be able to recognize something we already have. In electing the ability to perceive instead of the will to know, you placed yourself in a position where you could resemble your Father only by perceiving miraculously. But you lost the knowledge that you yourself are a miracle. Miraculous creation was your own source and also your own real function. God created man in his own image and likeness is correcting meaning, but the words are open to considerable misinterpretation. This is avoided, however, if image is understood to mean thought and likeness is taken as of a like quality. God did create the sun in his own thought and of a quality like to his own. There is nothing else. Perception is impossible without a belief in more and less. Unless perception at every level involves selectivity, It is incapable of organization. In all types of perception, there is a continual process of accepting and rejecting, of organizing and reorganizing, and of shifting and changing focus. Evaluation is an essential aspect of perception because judgment must be made as the basis for selection. Lack of lack is a concept which is meaningless to a perceiver because the ability to perceive at all rests on lack. What happens to perceptions if there are no judgments and there is nothing but perfect equality? Perception is automatically useless. Truth can only be known. All of it is equally true, and to know any part of it is to know all of it. Only perception involves partial awareness. Knowledge transcends all of the laws which govern perception. Partial knowledge is impossible. It is all one and has no separate parts, i.e., the parts have not separated. This is the real knowledge. You who are really one with it need but know yourself, and your knowledge is complete. To know God's miracle is to know Him. Forgiveness is the healing of the perception of separation. Correct perception of each other is necessary only because minds have willed to see themselves as separate beings. Each son knows God completely. This is the miraculous power of the Son. The fact that each son has this power completely is a fact which is entirely alien to human thinking, in which if any one has everything, there is nothing left. God's miracles are as total as His thought, because they are His thoughts. God shines in them all with perfect light. If they recognize this light anywhere, they know it universally. Revelation cannot be explained because it is knowledge. Revelation happens. It is the only really natural happening because it reflects the nature of God. As long as perception lasts, prayer has a place. Since perception rests on lack, those who perceive have not totally accepted the atonement and given over themselves to truth. Perception is a separated state, and the perceiver does need healing. Communion, not prayer, is the natural state of those who know. God and His miracles are inseparable. All words, at best, are preparatory. The word is really a thought. No one word is universally meaningful, because a word is a symbol. But thought is not divisible at the level of creation. The original name for thought and word was the same. The quotation should read, "In the beginning was the thought, and the thought was with God, and the thought was God." How beautiful indeed are the thoughts of God who live in His light. Your worth is beyond perception because it is beyond doubt. Do not perceive yourself in different lights. Know yourself in the one light where the miracle, which is you, is perfectly clear. 8. The essential goal of therapy. When two people experience a dominant submission problem, it is often related to the perceived opposition between helping and being helped. This is a misperception resulting from the failure to recognize the equal worth of both individuals in the interaction. There can be no confusion on this point, and no strain if this confusion is not introduced. Such confusion may be experienced by a person when someone else is trying to help him. He is likely to feel that this puts him in a subordinate position if he thinks he should be the therapist. Obviously, there is no problem once it is recognized that the equal worth of each person precludes this misperception, since both gain in such a transaction. It is impossible for anybody to ever lose anything when this is fully recognized. This is what recognizing your brother is all about. The prerequisites for therapy must include the following conditions. 1. The procedure must involve the recognition rather than the denial of the importance of thought. 2. The exact equality of everyone who is involved must also be recognized. This must include me. 3. No one is either therapist or patient. You could add teacher or pupil. 4. Above all, everyone involved must want to give up everything that is not true. The reason for the negative emphasis here is that therapy implies something has gone wrong. Although the purpose of therapy is to correct this, those who are ill are negative. Therapy is exactly the same as all other forms of miracle working. It has no separate laws of its own. All of the principles that were given for miracles apply to therapy because, unless therapy proceeds from miracle-mindedness, it cannot heal. The therapist, hopefully, does have the role of being the better perceiver. This is also, again hopefully, true of the teacher. It does not follow that he is the better knower. Temporarily, the therapist or teacher can help in straightening out twisted perceptions, which is also the only role that I would ever contribute myself. All therapy should do is try to place everyone involved in the right frame of mind to help one another. It is essentially a process of true courtesy, including courtesy to me. You should know that all God's children are fully worthy of complete courtesy. There are ways of treating others in which only consistent courtesy, even in very little things, is offered. It is a very healing habit to acquire. Any form of mental illness can truthfully be described as an expression of viciousness. We said before that those who are afraid are apt to be vicious. If we were willing to forgive other people's misperceptions of us, they could not possibly affect us at all. There is little doubt that you can explain your present attitudes in terms of how people used to look at you, but there is no wisdom in doing so. In fact, the whole historical approach can justifiably be called doubtful. Consider your parents, for example. No one has adopted all of his parents' attitudes as his own. In every case, there has been a long process of choice in which the individual has escaped from those he himself vetoed, while retaining those he voted for. For instance, someone might not have retained his parents' political beliefs because he believed he was free in this area, yet he might still have retained their misperception of his worth. In this case, there must be some acute problem of his own that would make him so eager to accept this. This tendency can always be regarded as punitive. It cannot be justified by the inequality of the strengths of parents and children. This is never more than temporary and is largely a matter of maturational and thus physical difference. It does not last unless it is held on to. Why should anyone accord an obvious misperception so much power? There cannot be any real justification for it, because even you yourself recognize the real problem when you say, "How could they do this to me?" The answer is, they didn't. You have a very serious question to ask yourself in this connection. We said before that the purpose of the resurrection was to demonstrate that no amount of misperception has any influence at all on a Son of God. This demonstration exonerates those who misperceive by establishing beyond doubt that they have not hurt anyone. Your question, which you must ask yourself very honestly, is whether you are willing to demonstrate that your parents have not hurt you. Unless you are willing to do this, you have not forgiven them. The essential goal of therapy is the same as that of knowledge. No one can survive independently as long as he is willing to see himself through the eyes of others. This will always put him in a position where he must see himself in different lights. Parents do not make the self-image of their children, though they may perceive images which they do make. However, as we have already said, you are not an image. If you side with image makers, you are merely being idolatrous. You have no justification whatever for perpetuating any image of yourself at all. You are not an image. Whatever is true of you is wholly benign. It is essential that you know this about yourself, but you cannot know it while you choose to interpret yourself as vulnerable enough to be hurt. This is a peculiar kind of arrogance, whose narcissistic component is perfectly obvious. It endows the perceiver with sufficient unreal strength to make you over, and then acknowledges the perceiver's miscreation. There are times when this strange lack of real courtesy appears to be a form of humility. Actually, it is never more than simple spite. Your parents probably did misperceive you in many ways, but their ability to perceive may have been quite warped, and their misperception stood in the way of their own knowledge. There is no reason why it should stand in the way of yours. It is still true that you believe they did something to you. This belief is extremely dangerous to your perception and wholly destructive of your knowledge. This is not only true of your attitudes toward your parents, but also of your misuse of your friends. You still think that you must respond to their errors as if they were true. By reacting self-destructively, you are giving them approval for their misperceptions. No one has the right to change himself according to different circumstances. Only his actions are capable of appropriate variation. His belief in himself is a constant, unless it rests on perceptual acuity rather than knowledge of what he is. It is your duty to establish beyond doubt that you are totally unwilling to side with, identify with anyone's misperceptions of you, including your own. 9. The fear of teaching. As a teacher, if you become concerned with totally irrelevant factors, such as the physical condition of the classroom, the number of students, the hour of the course, and the many elements which you may choose to select for emphasis as a basis for misperception, you have lost the knowledge of what any interpersonal relationship is for. It is not true that the difference between pupil and teacher is lasting. They meet in order to abolish the difference. At the beginning, since we're still in time, they come together on the basis of inequality of ability and experience. The aim of the teacher is to give pupils more of what is temporarily his. This process has all of the miracle conditions we referred to at the beginning. The teacher, or miracle worker, gives more to those who have less, bringing them closer to equality with him, at the same time gaining for himself. The confusion here is only because teacher and pupil do not gain the same things, because they do not need the same things. If they did, their respective, though temporary roles would not be conducive to mutual profit. Freedom from fear can be achieved by both teacher and pupil only if they do not compare in either their needs or their positions in regard to each other in terms of higher and lower. Presumably, children must learn from parents. What parents learn from children is merely of a different order. Ultimately, there is no difference in order, but this involves only knowledge. Neither parents nor children can be said to have knowledge, or their relationships would not exist as if they were on different levels. The same is true of the teacher and the pupil. Children have an authority problem only if they believe that their image is influenced by the authority. This is an act of will on their part, because they are electing to misperceive the authority and give him this power. A teacher with an authority problem is merely a pupil who refuses to teach others. He wants to maintain himself in a position where he can be misused and misperceived. This makes him resentful of teaching because of what he insists it has done to him. The only way out of this particular aspect of the desert is still to leave. The way this is left is to release everyone involved by absolutely refusing to engage in any form of honouring error. Neither teacher nor pupil is imprisoned by learning unless he uses it as an attack. If he does this, he will be imprisoned whether he actually teaches or learns, or refuses to engage in the process at all. The role of a teacher, properly conceived, is one of leading himself and others out of the desert. The value of this role can hardly be underestimated, if only because it was one to which I very gladly dedicated my own life. I have repeatedly asked my pupils to follow me. This means that to be effective teachers, they must interpret teaching as I do. I have made every effort to teach you entirely without fear. If you do not listen, you will be unable to avoid the very obvious error of perceiving teaching as a threat. It is hardly necessary to say that teaching is a process whose purpose is to produce learning. The ultimate purpose of all learning is to abolish fear. This is necessary so that knowledge can happen. The role of the teacher is not the role of God. This confusion is all too frequently made by parents, teachers, therapists, and the clergy. It is a real misunderstanding of both God and his miracles. Any teacher who believes that teaching is fearful cannot learn because he is paralyzed. He also cannot really teach. You would be right to maintain that this course is a prerequisite for any rightful course you may teach. However, you would really be saying much more than that. The purpose of this course is to prepare you for knowledge. So is the only real purpose of any legitimate course. All that is required of you as a teacher is to follow me. Whenever anyone decides that he can function only in some roles but not in others, he cannot but be attempting to make a compromise which will not work. If you are under the belief that you are coping with your fear of teaching by functioning in related roles, but not as a teacher of students, you are merely deceiving yourself. You owe yourself greater respect. There is nothing as tragic as the attempt to deceive oneself, because it implies that you perceive yourself as so unworthy that deception is more fitting for you than truth. Either you can function in all of the roles you have properly undertaken to fill, or you cannot function effectively in any of them. This is an all or none decision. You cannot make inappropriate level distinctions within this choice. You are either capable or not. This does not mean that you can do everything, but it does mean that you are either totally miracle-minded or not. This decision is open to no compromise whatever. When you say that you cannot teach, you are acting as if universal laws apply to everyone except you. This is not only arrogant, but patently untrue. Universal laws must apply to you unless you do not exist. We will not bother to argue about this. Descartes engaged in a very interesting teaching procedure, and one from which he himself learned a great deal. He began with doubting the existence of everything except himself. He insisted that his own existence was not open to doubt and rebuilt his entire thought system on the one premise, I think, therefore I am. It is noteworthy that he arrived at accepting the entire system he originally doubted, solely on the basis of this one piece of knowledge. There was, however, a distinct shift in his own perception. He no longer really questioned the reality of what he perceived, because he knew he was there. Perhaps you are not too sure of this, and for this reason we suggest that you concentrate on "Here I am, Lord." Repeat this very short phrase and don't think of anything else. Just pull in your mind slowly from everywhere else and center it on these words. A teacher is unlikely to be effective unless he begins with being there. This is not really open to question. You will lose all your fear of teaching and relating in any form once you know who you are. There is no point whatever in remaining in the prison of believing that this is up to you. You do not exist in different lights. It is this belief which has confused you about your own reality. Why would you want to remain so obscure to yourself? 10. Judgment and the authority problem. We have already discussed the last judgment in some, though insufficient, detail. After the last judgment, there isn't any more. This is symbolic only in the sense that everybody is much better off without judgment. When the Bible says, "Judge not, that ye be not judged," it merely means that if you judge the reality of others at all, you will be unable to avoid judging your own. The choice to judge rather than know has been the cause of the loss of peace. Judgment is the process on which perception, but not knowledge, rests. We covered this before in terms of selectivity. Evaluation was said at that time to be perception's obvious prerequisite. Judgment always involves rejection. It is not an ability which emphasizes only the positive aspects of what is judged, whether it be in or out of the self. However, what has been perceived and rejected, or judged and found wanting, remains in the unconscious because it has been perceived. Watson had a very relevant notion of the unconscious in this connection. In fact, it was so relevant that he dropped it as officially out of accord with behaviorism. He was right on both counts. One of the illusions from which human perception suffers is that what it perceives and judges against has no effect. This cannot be true unless you also believe that what your judgment vetoes does not exist. You evidently do not believe this, or you would not have judged against it. It does not really matter in the end whether you judge right or wrong. Either way, you are placing your belief in the unreal. This cannot be avoided in any type of judgment because it implies the belief that reality is yours to choose from. You have no idea of the tremendous release and deep peace that comes from meeting yourself and your brothers totally, without judgment. If you will look back at the earlier remarks about what you and your brothers are, you will realize that judging them in any way is really without meaning. In fact, their meaning is lost to you precisely because you are judging them. All uncertainty comes from a totally fallacious belief that you are under the coercion of judgment. You do not need it to organize your life, and you certainly do not need it to organize yourself. When you look upon knowledge, all judgment is automatically suspended, and this is the process that enables recognition to replace perception. You're very fearful of everything you have perceived and refused to accept. You believe that because you have refused to accept it, you have lost control over it. This is why you see it in nightmares or in pleasant disguise in what seem to be happier dreams. Nothing that you have refused to accept can be brought into awareness. It does not follow that it is dangerous, but it does follow that you have made it dangerous. When you feel tired, it is merely because you have judged yourself as capable of being tired. When you laugh at someone, it is because you have judged him as debased. When you laugh at yourself, you are singularly likely to laugh at others, if only because you cannot tolerate being more debased than others. All of this does make you tired, because it is essentially disheartening. You are not really capable of being tired, but you are very capable of wearying yourself. The strain of constant judgment is virtually intolerable. It is a curious thing that any ability which is so debilitating should be so deeply cherished, but there is a very good reason for this. This, however, depends upon what you mean by good. If you wish to be the author of reality, which is totally impossible anyway, then you will insist on holding on to judgment. You will also use the term with considerable fear and believe that judgment will someday be used against you. To whatever extent it is used against you, it is due only to your belief in its efficacy as a weapon of defense for your own authority. The issue of authority is really a question of authorship. When an individual has an authority problem, it is always because he believes he is the author of himself and resents his own projection of this delusion onto others. He then perceives the situation as one in which two people are literally fighting for his own authorship. This is the fundamental error of all those who believe they have usurped the power of God. The belief is very frightening to them, but hardly troubles God at all. He is, however, eager to undo it, not to punish his children, but only because he knows that it makes them unhappy. God's sons were given their own true authorship, but they preferred to remain anonymous when they chose to separate themselves from their author. The word authority has been one of their most fearful symbols ever since. Authority has been used for great cruelty because, being uncertain of their true authorship, people believed that their creation was anonymous. This has left them in a position where it sounds meaningful to consider the possibility that they must have created themselves. The dispute over authorship has left such uncertainty in the mind that some people have gone so far as to doubt whether they were ever created at all. Despite the apparent contradiction in this position, it is in one sense more tenable than the view that they created themselves. At least it acknowledges the fact some true authorship is necessary for existence. Only those who give over all desire to reject can know that their own rejection is impossible. You have not usurped the power of God, but you have lost it. Fortunately, when you lose something, this does not mean that the something has gone. It merely means that you do not know where it is. Existence does not depend on your ability to identify it or even to place it. It is perfectly possible to look on reality without judgment and merely know it is there. By knowing this, you are not doubting its reality at all. Peace is a natural heritage of the Son. Everyone is free to refuse to accept his inheritance, but he is not free to establish what his inheritance is. The problem which everyone must decide is the fundamental question of his own authorship. All fear comes ultimately, and sometimes by way of very devious routes, from the denial of authorship. The offence is never to God, but only to the denier himself. He has thrown away the reason for his own peace and sees himself only in pieces. This strange perception is an authority problem. It is also the basis for the castration anxiety since both forms of error are fundamentally the same. You cannot find peace while this authority problem continues. But the truth is still that there is no problem about this. There is no one who does not feel that he is imprisoned in some way. If this has been the result of his own free will, he must regard his will as if it were not free. All the obviously circular reasoning of his own position would be quite apparent. Free will must lead to freedom. Judgment always imprisons, because it separates segments of reality according to the highly unstable scales of desire. Wishes are not facts by definition. To wish is to imply that willing is not sufficient. However, no one really believes that what is wished is as real as what is willed. Instead of, "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven," say, "Will ye first the kingdom of heaven?" And you have said, "I know what I am, and I will to accept my own inheritance." 11. The unshakable foundation. It is essential that this whole authority problem be voluntarily dismissed once and for all. You do not understand how important this is for your sanity. You're quite insane on this point. This is not a judgment, it is merely a fact. It is just as much a fact as God is. A fact is literally a making or a starting point. You do start from this point, and all your thinking is inverted because of it. Every system of thought must have a starting point. It begins with either a making or a creating, a difference which we have already covered. Both are acts of will, except that making involves doing, while creating involves active willing. Their resemblance lies in the power as foundations. Their difference lies in what rests upon them. Both are cornerstones for systems of belief by which you live. It is a mistake to believe that a thought system which is based on lies is weak. Nothing made by a child of God is without power. It is absolutely essential that you realize this, because otherwise you will not understand why you have so much trouble with this course, and will be unable to escape from the prison you have made for yourself. You have made the error of the psychotherapist we described in some detail before. Yet you cannot resolve the authority problem by depreciating the power of your mind. It can hurt you if you misuse it, but you know its strength, and you can also know that you cannot weaken it, any more than you can weaken God. The devil is a frightening concept only because he is thought of as extremely powerful and extremely active. He is perceived as a force in combat with God, battling him for the possession of souls. He deceives by lies and builds kingdoms of his own in which everything is in direct opposition to God. Yet he attracts men rather than repels them, and they are perceived as willing to sell him their souls in return for gifts they know are of no real worth at all. This makes absolutely no sense. The whole picture is one in which man acts in a way he himself realizes is self-destructive, but which he does not will to correct, and therefore perceives the cause as beyond his control. We have discussed the fall or separation before, but its meaning must be clearly understood without symbols. The separation is not symbolic. The fruit of only one tree was forbidden to man in the symbolic garden, but God could not have forbidden it, or it could not have been eaten. If God knows his children, and I assure you he does, would he have put them in a position where their own destruction was possible? The tree which was forbidden was correctly named the tree of knowledge, yet God created knowledge and gave it freely to his creations. The symbolism here is open to many interpretations, but you may be sure that any interpretation which perceives either God or his creations as if they were capable of destroying their own purpose is wrong. Eating of the tree of knowledge is a symbolic expression for incorporating into the self the ability for self-creation. This is the only sense in which God and his sons are not co-creators. The belief that they are is implicit in the self-concept, a concept now made acceptable by its weakness and explained by a tendency of the self to make an image of itself. Its fear aspect is usually ascribed to the father figure, a particularly interesting idea in view of the fact that nobody means the physical father by the term. It refers to an image of a father in relation to an image of the self. Once again, images are perceived, not known. Knowledge cannot deceive, but perception can. You can perceive yourself as self-creating, but you cannot do more than believe it. You cannot make it true. I told you before that when you finally perceive correctly, you can only be glad you can't. But until then, belief that you can is the central foundation stone in your thought system, and all your defenses are used to attack ideas which would bring it to light. You still believe you're an image of your own creation. You are split with your own spirit on this point, and there is no resolution, because you believe the one thing that is literally inconceivable. That is why you cannot create and are afraid to make or produce. The mind can make the belief in separation very real and very fearful. And this belief is the devil. It is powerful, active, destructive, and clearly in opposition to God, because it literally denies his fatherhood. Never underestimate the power of this denial. Look at your life and see what the devil has made. But know that this making will surely dissolve in the light of truth, because its foundation is a lie. Your creation by God is the only foundation which cannot be shaken, because the light is in it. Your starting point is truth, and you must return to this beginning. Much has been perceived since then, but nothing else has happened. That is why your spirit is still in peace, even though your mind is in conflict. You have not yet gone back far enough, and that is why you become so fearful. As you approach the beginning, you feel the fear of the destruction of your thought system upon you, as if it were the fear of death. There is no death, but there is a belief in death. The Bible says that the tree that bears no fruit will be cut off and will wither away. Be glad. The light will shine from the true foundation of life, and your own thought system will stand corrected. It cannot stand otherwise. You who fear salvation are willing death. Life and death, light and darkness, knowledge and perception are irreconcilable. To believe that they can be reconciled is to believe that God and you cannot. Only the oneness of knowledge is conflict-free. Your kingdom is not of this world because it was given you from beyond this world. Only in this world is the idea of an authority problem meaningful. The world is not left by death, but by truth, and truth can be known by all those for whom the kingdom was created and for whom it waits.